Hello friends, this is Ruslan Belov's channel, a brief summary on Ukraine for February 15th, 2026. Zelensky has again started talking about an energy ceasefire. The Ukrainian delegation plans to raise this issue on February 17th through 18th in Geneva, which was also confirmed by the head negotiator Umarov. Meanwhile, according to open data, Russia has completed preparations for another massive strike. Possible targets include not only energy infrastructure, but also enterprises and UAV warehouses, as well as the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the armed forces of Ukraine are developing a counteroffensive. Strikes on several facilities simultaneously are not ruled out. On the night of February 14th through 15th, Ukrainian drones attacked southern Russia, Krasnodar Krai and Rostov Oblast, including the Sochi area. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported 156 drones shot down, 68 at night, and another 88 in the morning. Active air defense operations and the presence of NATO reconnaissance aircraft were recorded in the region on the eve of the strikes. Later, reports appeared about attempted attacks toward Moscow. Against the backdrop of threats of strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, Kiev is essentially going all in, actively using UAVs, which simultaneously reveals their production locations, priority targets for Russia. In response, Russia struck Odessa and the region, primarily the railway junction north of the city. According to data from open sources, attacks on southern Russia could have been coordinated from there. This is already the fourth strike on the region in recent days. Since February 12th, strikes on energy infrastructure, warehouses and presumed launch sites have been recorded, and February 15th became the culmination of the series. Likely, after the operation is completed, the intensity of attacks from both sides will temporarily decrease. At the same time, there remains another key target for Russia: the Zaporizhzhia front sector, where the armed forces of Ukraine recently began a counteroffensive, deploying their most prepared units. I want to remind you that in the vanguard of the first wave of the Sudzha offensive strike, the 82nd and 92nd Brigades operated, and now on the Zaporizhzhia front sector, we are directly encountering, detecting and receiving reports and materials about these same formations, which apparently were withdrawn for reorganization and personnel replenishment after the completion of the Sudzha operation. The 82nd Brigade formation represents one of the largest assault brigades of the Ukrainian armed forces, and it is precisely this unit that is now deployed in this direction and in cooperation with other formations of the Ukrainian army is attempting to cut off the upper echelon of defense of the Russian armed forces, deployed between the Gaicha River, the settlements of Bratske, Andreevka, and further east, almost to Velika Novosilka. As can be noted, today a significant number of various markers arrived from this direction, so I propose to examine and analyze everything in detail. Before beginning, let's look at how the map has been modified over the last several days. This is how the cartographic situation was presented on February 13th. Already at that time, individual pro-Russian-oriented analysts, individual independent cartographers, began publishing data that concealing the presence of some counteroffensive essentially makes no sense. Something is really developing. And initial information about what is developing in this direction began to leak into the information space. And already on February 14th, based on pro-Ukrainian-oriented cartographic resources, a correction is made, adding a grey zone to the territories south of the settlements Pokrovska and Velikomykhailivka. In other words, all these territories were coloured in grey zone. Additionally, the first video recording appeared, demonstrating that indeed, individual groupings, individual formations, individual units of armoured vehicles of the Ukrainian armed forces managed to break through the defence of the Russian armed forces and penetrate probably into the rear areas of the defending Russian positions. And today already, on February 15th, an even larger scale correction is being made not only in the northern direction, but also in the western direction. However, in addition to all these aspects, there is another very important piece of news that was published by Telegram channels connected, affiliated with the Vostok troop grouping, and for some reason, almost no one paid attention to this news, although the news is actually quite significant. Yesterday, the Vostok troop grouping, more precisely Telegram channels affiliated with this grouping, published data that the 29th Guards Combined Arms Army of the Vostok troop grouping the 11th Guards Air Force and Air Defense Army for mass heroism and courage, steadfastness and bravery displayed by personnel in the course of fulfilling combat missions, were awarded the Order of Suvorov. To a certain degree, it would seem, some ordinary congratulation, award, probably indeed some merits. But there is one small moment that is missed by most analysts. The point is that, let's say, the 29th Army was rewarded, and if someone is tracking the deployment of formations of the Russian armed forces, then the 29th Army, if the information I have doesn't mislead me, is deployed approximately in this sector. In other words, this is their zone of responsibility. In other words, the zone of responsibility is actually the point of the main strike of the Ukrainian armed forces. In other words, we observe that the Vostok troop grouping, and also, let's say, the military leadership of the Russian Federation, emphasized that when Starlinks were shut off, the offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces began. And actually, and apparently, the 29th Army to a certain degree found itself without communication, without connection with the main rear. This still did not disrupt the combat defensive orders of the 29th Army. We observe such, let's say, formulations as heroism, mass heroism, steadfastness. Apparently, this indicates that probably the Ukrainian side expected that as soon as the 29th Army found itself without communication, without any connection with the main rear, with the main formations located a bit to the south, then probably the 29th Army would falter, or probably would allow a significant number of series of strikes that would allow the Ukrainian side to take the 29th Army in a cauldron. However, information published by Russian sources indicates the opposite. Units displayed steadfastness, courage, and mass heroism, and actually probably that map configuration that we observe today is precisely the consequence of all these events, all this mass steadfastness and so on and so forth. But now let's return once again to the markers after all. A significant number of video materials are being published now. Various cartographic resources, one after another, are correcting maps. However, it is necessary to understand and once again sort of constantly keep in memory that to assert for now that all these settlements have come under the control of either the Ukrainian armed forces or the Russian Federation is inappropriate and incorrect. At the present moment, the Ukrainian side, again, I repeat, the 82nd Brigade formation, which in its time participated in combat operations in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Their tactic is not to push the front line. Their tactic is to bypass all strong points and occupy positions in the rear. Occupy main roads, occupy bridges, occupy forest belts. And here we are now observing an analogous operation to the one we observed in the Zaporizhzhia district. The 82nd Brigade formation of the Ukrainian armed forces, probably the 92nd, Da Vinci Wolves, 225th, 425th Assault Regiments of Ukraine are trying to break through, slip through, slide between settlements, break out downward. The weather is actually disgusting right now, and there is currently no continuous defense line because it is quite difficult to hold under such weather conditions. Therefore, they infiltrate, slip through with the goal of getting as far south as possible, getting as far behind the main defense line of the Russian armed forces as possible, already, probably, from this sector, holding the line, giving time to the main assault formations of the Ukrainian armed forces, let's say, to conduct some clearing, to conduct precisely advancement in this direction already, fighting with those Russian units that may find themselves cut off from the main rear, from the main part of the army, and from other units. This is what is happening in this direction. Also, a significant amount of information is arriving from the western flank as well. Fighting continues in the area of Ternovato, Kosovtsevo. Moreover, there are various analysts and various opinions that Ukrainian units from the composition of diversionary reconnaissance groups managed to penetrate deep into the rear, all the way to Zlogoda, all the way to Privolye, all the way to Rybnoye. In other words, fighting is continuing here now. But the Russian army, already, probably what day is it? It's difficult to determine of this counteroffensive, probably the 6th, 7th, probably the 10th. It's difficult to determine since one can take the count from the shut-off of Starlinks. One can a bit later. But precisely now the Russian army is beginning to actively operate in this direction, taking some most serious countermeasures. Let's begin with the simplest. Massive strikes on all crossings, on all bridges located along the Vovcha River, are beginning. In other words, of course, One can ask the question why this wasn't done earlier, why the bridges weren't destroyed a week ago, a month ago there, to prevent this counteroffensive altogether. But actually, what kind of situation is developing now? Russian aviation is working intensively on crossings along the Vovcha River, and these first 10 days of the offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces, as well as the steadfastness of individual units of the Russian Federation in this sector, allowed the following picture to happen. Zelensky under pressure, under all these political moments and so on and so forth, apparently, was forced to introduce into battle a significant number of reserves, units and forces, which were transferred and have already managed to transfer to the southern bank of the Vovcha River. In other words, precisely into all this grey zone. Right now, a fairly large number of Ukrainian units are swarming here. Of course, we're not talking about tens, not about hundreds of thousands, but probably already several thousand units there. Several thousand soldiers are already located south of the Vovcha River. And as soon as these units, these parts cross the river, already concentrated, settled and consolidated in this direction, then work on bridges, on crossings began, in order to actually cut off, again, these same units from possible retreat, with the goal of exiting to the northern part of the Vovcha River, to the northern bank, and also probably to prevent, of course, including the transfer of additional forces to this direction. But it seems to me that still the Russian command set itself the task of allowing as many Ukrainian units as possible to cross the Vovcha River, so that precisely on this side a fairly substantial army would gather, the loss of which could turn out to be a very painful moment for all, let's say, the defensive capability and integrity of the Ukrainian army on the Zaporizhzhia sector. Also precisely the forcing and concentration of Ukrainian forces south of the Vovcha River allowed the Russian army to activate an offensive from the direction of Ivanovka toward Havrilivka. Today, some pro-Russian neutral cartographers report this. According to information from open sources, the Russian army began a sudden offensive toward the settlement of Havrilivka from the direction of the settlement of Ivanovka. Actually, a most important offensive, and this offensive pursues the following goal. Firstly, to strike actually at the rear of the grouping of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is now actively advancing southward. Plus the exit to Havrilivka, probably, and also if this attack is some unexpected attack for units of the Ukrainian armed forces, rapid entry into the territory of Havrilivka from the direction of the settlements Andreevka, Klivtsovo, as well as Ivanovka, can allow the Russian army to seriously disrupt the overall logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces in the offensive zone. Moreover, in case the attack was really thought through, and not now some measure of rapid counteraction, then further possible advancement toward the settlement Mala Mikhailivka can in general nullify all attempts of the Ukrainian armed forces to advance south of the Vovcha River, since with such a configuration, we observe that even some cauldron and encirclement is forming, and also unambiguously control is established over railways, over main logistical routes. The Ukrainian side will unambiguously, under such conditions, have to change and correct its plans. In other words, we are now observing this offensive. This strike, it's difficult to determine how unexpected it is for the Ukrainian armed forces, but if it is unexpected, and if the Ukrainian side did not prepare for this offensive from the Russian Federation, then this can lead to maximally sad consequences for the entire offensive operation. And further, we move to another interesting piece of news, more precisely to a series of news published today by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, against the backdrop of fierce combat operations in the area of Uspanivka. To the north and west, today the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russian army managed to significantly improve its positions in the area of the settlement Tsvetkove. Moreover, video material was published dedicated to combat operations, but without episodes of flag raising on the territory of this settlement. But this doesn't indicate that the settlement didn't fall, its defense didn't collapse. This indicates that apparently due to security measures, a decision was made not to wave flags. And based on the Ministry of Defense report, as well as based on the video material, we accordingly made a correction. We observed that despite the probably seeming situation in the northern sectors, we observe that in the Orikhiv direction, the Russian army is trying not to drop, not to reduce the pace. Another piece of news is already coming to us, again from the Ministry of Defense, but already from the western Zaporizhzhia direction. Today, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation also reports that the Russian army managed to substantially and significantly improve its positions in the area of the settlements Primorske, Magdalenivka, and Zapasne. In other words, based on this Ministry of Defense report, we are making a correction. Well, if we talk about the western Zaporizhzhia direction, then there is quite serious confusion here. And we observe that indeed, if we talk about this direction, the reports of the Ministry of Defense, the reports of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine very much contradict each other. Let me remind you that the map in this sector looked like this on February 10, 2026. This was precisely that moment, apparently, when the Ukrainian side also in this sector went on the counteroffensive. And already on February 11th, a large number of corrections are made, including the settlement Richna, Lukyanivske, Novoboykivske, Novoyakovlivka. Moreover, there was even some video material or photograph where Ukrainian units, soldiers, are raising a flag at this point. In other words, here, unambiguously, some counter-offensive from the Ukrainian armed forces also began. And according to that information that was present in open sources, also partially confirmed by pro-Russian sources, here the Ukrainian side was going on the counter-offensive. And today, on the 15th, information is arriving absolutely opposite to the picture that has been in the open access, in open sources recently. In other words, this indicates that it's still early to draw conclusions, any conclusions at all, about what is happening now on the Zaporizhzhia sector, whether western or eastern Zaporizhzhia. Starlinks are shut off, and this was also done intentionally so that apparently those units of the Russian Federation that are at zero would not have the ability to operatively transfer information about combat operations in the sector into open access. Therefore, everything here is very, very complicated. And news sometimes contradicts each other. One side declares its advancement, the second side declares its advancement. And it's generally difficult to figure out. One thing is clear, that this is the decisive general battle of 2026, which was supposed to begin somewhere closer to May-June of 2026. But the general battle began at the very, very beginning of 2026. And an impression is created that simply someone's nerves gave out. Because from the result and from the final outcome of the Zaporizhzhia general battle of 2026, not only the entire military campaign of 2026 can be determined, but in general the conflict on the territory of Ukraine can be completely and finally resolved and concluded. Well, we will observe. We will observe how the situation will develop further. Further, we move to the Kostiantynivka sector. Here in this direction, there are also small corrections south of the city. The map was corrected in this way over the outgoing day. Russian units gradually are infiltrating into the southern, southwestern parts of the settlement. On the Sloviansk direction, without changes. The map didn't undergo any substantial corrections. Although today the Chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, as well as information from open sources, indicate that the Russian army is gradually entering already into the final concluding part of the battle for the triangle Reznikivka, Kalaniki, Kriva Luka. For this defense line, the Lyman direction without changes, also the Kupiansk direction without changes. On the northern sectors, advancement of Russian units is noted. Today, individual cartographers confirm that the Russian army is gradually expanding its bridgehead south of the settlement Sarida, in the area of Zelene, in the direction toward the settlement Vesele. The state border, this is the Liptsy sector, more precisely, this is something between the Liptsy and Vovchansk directions. Also today, information is arriving that the Russian army is actively storming and advancing in the area of the settlement Kondrativka. Here the map was corrected over the last day quite actively. In other words, apparently, in the near future, the battle for this settlement will conclude. Also today, information is already arriving, the first information that the Russian army managed to enter the territory of the settlements Mala Korchakovka, Novosich. In other words, actually the Russian army is managing to get a foothold on the second defense line on the Sumy sector of the front, which promises actually quite big problems in perspective for the capital of this region, the city of Sumy. And that's everything, dear friends. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.